Greetings, comrades! Today we have a rather interesting topic, but at first glance it may seem somewhat strange to you. Let me explain. The fact is that I encounter this point of view quite often from people who don't like Russia, or more precisely from the representatives of the other Slavic nations who do not like Russia very much. They say, look, you are not our Slavic brothers at all. You are some kind of Finno-Ugric people mixed with the Mongols, so this thing you do when you call yourself Slavs is the cultural appropriation. Slavs are Serbs, Poles, Ukrainians, but Russians are just a mix of some Asian tribes which already 700 years ago had no relation neither to Slavs nor to Kievan Rus. And by the way, why did you name your country Russia? In order to appropriate your rights to Rus? You are not their successors. This is an interesting point of view. So today let me try to tell you about the reasoning of its supporters. I have mentioned this many times, but I will mention it again. Naturally, today I will speak of Russians as an ethnic group, not as all people who live in Russia. There are more than 170 different nationalities living in Russia, and of course the Avars or Yakuts are not Slavs. Although they are certainly inhabitants of Russia, and in English the same word is used for them – Russians. Today I will talk about ethnic Russians. Statistically there are about 80% of them in Russia. It is generally accepted today that they are the largest Slavic nation in the world. But for some reason, some nationalist-minded residents of other Slavic countries deny Russians this right. First I'll tell you briefly where this point of view comes from, and why some people believe it. So, the father of this opinion is the Polish ethnographer and historian Franciszek Duchiński. In Russian historiography he is more often referred to as a Polish ultranationalist rather than an ethnographer, but for the sake of objectivity I will try to refrain from this. Franciszek was born in what is now Ukraine, lived in Kiev and then emigrated to France. It was there that he created his theory that the Great Russians, or as Duchiński called them, Moskals, do not belong to the Slavic and even to the Aryan tribe, but are a branch of the Turanian tribe on par with the Mongols, and that they appropriate the name Russians to themselves unjustly. In fact, this name belongs rightly only to the Little Russians, Ukrainians and Belarusians, who are close to the Poles in their origin. The very language that Moskals now speak is the Church Slavonic language, artificially borrowed and corrupted by them, which has ousted some Turanian language that so-called Russians used before. So I will present his points in a more comprehensible language. The real Russians are the Belarusians and Ukrainians, and the Moskals have appropriated their name and culture. Naturally, Duchiński saw salvation in the restoration of a Slavic Polish state, which would encompass the kindred tribes of the Little Russians and Belarusians and would serve as a stronghold against the Turanian power of the Moskals for Western Europe. Naturally, such a doctrine was enthusiastically accepted among the Poles. The very origin of this idea is absolutely clear. The Russian Empire then promoted the ideology of Pan-Slavism, designed to prove that all Slavic people should unite under the scepter of the Russian Tsar. The concept of the non-Slavic origin of Russians countered these claims of Russian hegemony over the Slavs. Naturally, similar ideas are extremely popular among some Ukrainian historians. Some even denied Russia the right to be called Russia, calling it Moscovia, in order that people do not see a connection with the Great Kievan Rus in the very name of our country. In particular, the historian Anatoly Tsipko wrote that the Radziwill letterpiece with the text of the tale of bygone years was falsified by order of Peter the Great, so that Peter could officially link the history of the Russian Empire with Kievan Rus. Also, the name Russia in the Latin manner was chosen by him in order for the Western countries to confuse Russia and Rus. Strangely enough, the idea resonated even among the Russians themselves. Mikhail Pokrovsky, for example, during the Soviet times, insisted that Russians were at least 80% Finns and not Slavs. But let's move on to specific arguments. Supporters of this version have the following points. First, the Mongol yoke. Allegedly, Muscovy had been part of the Horde for several centuries, and in fact, during that time, no Slavs remained there. The territory became dominated by Mongol blood. Second, Some genetic studies have suggested that Russians are closer to Finns than to Slavs. And finally, the Russian language is only a semblance of the Slavic language. That is why, for example, Czechs and Poles understand each other without problems, and Russians do not understand the languages of other Slavs. Let's start with the Mongol yoke. More precisely, the Tatar-Mongol yoke, as it is called in Russia. I think no one will dispute the fact that the Russian principalities were dependent on the Mongol Empire and the Golden Horde for more than 200 years. However, there was no occupation of the Russian lands as a result of the Mongol conquest. Our lands became a distant outskirt of the Mongol Empire and later Golden Horde. There was no Mongolian administration. There were almost no Mongolian garrisons. In other words, conditions for mass blood mixing of Russians and Mongols were not created. There were simply not enough Mongols on the territory of modern Russia for it to happen. The Mongols or Tatars would invade, establish their power, plunder the villages and go elsewhere rather than stay here to live. Though it is necessary to note that marriages between the Russian princes and noble Mongols did occur from time to time. Indirect confirmations of my statements is the fact that Russians never became neither representatives of Mongoloid race like Mongols nor Muslims like Tatars. If we really are descendants of the Tatar Mongols, then where are my brown eyes and why am I still a Christian? Thus, yes, the Muscovite principalities were ruled by the Mongol state for over 250 years. Did this make people who lived there Mongols? No. Just as the inhabitants of India, which was under the rule of the British Empire for 100 years, did not suddenly become English people. The next argument is genetic research. This is my favorite argument of all contemporary articles on this topic. In fact, almost every month I see articles in Ukraine once again proving that Ukrainians and Russians are two very distant nations, and in general the DNA of Russians coincides with the DNA of Finns by 80%. Meanwhile, in Russia exactly the same articles are published where exactly the same general phrases prove that there are no Ukrainians and Belarusians at all. Genetic studies have proved that these are all one people and we should call them Russians. And both sides prefer not to bother with any actual evidence at all, hiding behind the general words genetic research. In fact, everything is absolutely clear here. The Tale of the Bygone Years, the oldest Russian chronicle, describing the famous invocation of the Varangians, states that Rurik was called by the following tribes: Chud, Slovenia, Krivichi and Vesi. And if the Sloveni and Krivichi are Slavic peoples, the Vesi and Chud are Finno-Ugric. Accordingly, what is surprising about the fact that the gene pool of the modern Russian people is a mix of genes from tribes that lived side by side for 1,000 years? Meanwhile, the territory of modern Ukraine and Belarus has been politically separated from Russia for about 400 years. It was being under authority of the Grand Duchy of Lithuania and Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth. Accordingly, over these years there was no active intermarriage between the peoples inhabiting these territories, and because of this, there are some differences in the gene pool, for example, between the Western Ukrainians and Russians. How does it cancel the fact that all these peoples descended from one common ancestor, the same Slavic tribes? It doesn't. The final argument is the Russian language. There are some very popular pictures on the internet showing that some Slavic languages are as close to each other as possible, and only Russian differs from them. As you know, there are three groups of Slavic languages: Western, Eastern and Southern. The fact of belonging to the same language group, East Slavic, shows that Ukrainian and Belarusian are the closest to Russian. Up to 13th, 14th centuries, the East Slavs spoke the same Old East Slavic dialect, which over time developed into three separate literary languages. It has been established that the lexicon of Russian and Ukrainian is identical in only 60%, whereas the remaining 40% of words in Ukrainian are of Polish origin. The lexicon of the Belarusian language coincides with the Ukrainian and Polish by about 70%. Why? Because these territories were under the influence of Rzeczpospolita for 400 years. It is logical that it influenced all spheres of life, including the development of language for Belarusians and Ukrainians. The same explanation can be used to explain the differences between the Russian and the language of the West Slavic group. They contain many borrowings from German, French, Italian, Latin. These languages have been influenced by Western Europe and each other, and therefore do differ quite seriously from modern Russian. Nevertheless, despite all the political and cultural boundaries, our languages still have a lot in common, which just does confirm the common origin of all these languages. But with the languages of the South Slavic group and Russian, it's a different story. They have a different structure, but a huge layer of shared vocabulary. Old Slavic vocabulary came to Russia from the Balkans with the first books back in the 10th century. It was from there that we received the written language. From the end of the 18th century, the pendulum swung in the opposite direction, and already the South Slavic languages experienced a powerful wave of Russian influence. These are natural processes, they do not make someone more or less Slavic. Thus, we can safely say that Russians can still call themselves Slavs with a clear conscience, or we can call ourselves Finno-Ugric people, or a mixture of them. We share a common history, culture and proto-language with the representatives of other Slavic nations. But at the same time, our language and culture have indeed been influenced by the cultures of other nations that lived near us. And that's okay. Just as other Slavic peoples were influenced by their neighbors, their European neighbors. Frankly speaking, it is strange to me in the 21st century to constantly hear these arguments about who are the right Slavs and who are the wrong ones. It would seem that less than 100 years ago, all this talk about right and wrong peoples has already led to disastrous consequences, but somehow some people do not want to calm down.